Hello and welcome to this 360 filming tips, tricks and things to avoid video. I'm Stephen Fisher and I'll be taking you on this journey from some lessons I've learned along the way. When filming, we want to try and use low footprint tripods or mounts. I tend to use light stands because this just means that the feet don't appear on the camera as much, because you'll find that 360 cameras tend to not be able to see directly below themselves. So if you have feet that stick out too far, it just means a little bit more work in editing to remove them afterwards. Where you position the action or your actors using a 360 camera is key. You want to always try and keep the stitch lines to the furthest most distance of your scene, and try and keep the closest action or closest parts of your scene within the lenses where possible. 360 cameras do a better job the further away the subject is, especially where the stitch lines are concerned. So we want to again just angle your camera minutely, and if you can connect your phone to your 360 camera to act as a viewfinder, or your 360 camera has a viewfinder on it, just keep doing tiny adjustments until the stitch line becomes barely visible. Again, further away the distances are, the better the stitch line will be, so try and keep your stitch lines to the furthest most points of the action, and try and keep actors or close-ups or anything that's getting close to the camera within 1 to 2 meters and within the most focal length of the lens itself. This is also applicable once we start looking at lighting. So if you've got lights in your scene, try and keep the lights pointing directly into a lens where possible, not at an angle. So what this will reduce or eliminate is this sort of haloing effect, where the light rays or the sort of lens flare itself gets cut where the stitch line is, as you can sort of see illustrated by this graphic on screen at the moment. So again, keep the stitch lines to the most distance, consider where your lights are, and again, just a little bit of tiny micro movements will just make your life a lot easier, because you can't always remove this in post. Now, when we're talking about stitch lines and distances we should keep and how we should position things within our scene, one thing that quite often gets overlooked is actually things like ceiling height. So, for example, you actually need to try and keep that distance all the way around the camera. That includes above it. And we tend to find that with ceilings that have repeating patterns or tiles, if they're too close to the camera, it does have trouble stitching it. So again, try and keep the 2 to 3 meter distance all the way around the camera where possible. It will just mean that your stitching process will be a lot easier and the quality will tend to come out a little bit better. Always position your 360 camera at the sort of height that you want the end user to experience it at. So I tend to, for example, if I want a kind of POV shot for the end users, whether it's going to be viewed in a VR headset or on a mobile phone or whatever, I tend to try and keep the camera lenses at roughly the eye level of the user. Depending on where you're going to be outputting your 360 film or 360 images, try and consider basically how the end user is going to be experiencing this. If you're aiming to create your 360 film for example, a VR headset, try to reduce the amount of movement that the camera has. Now, most 360 cameras are very good at stabilizing the advantages of being able to capture such a wide field of view. However, too excessive motion can cause things like motion sickness, so just bear that in mind when you're filming with a 360 camera. Because the camera can't see below itself, we always need to try and consider what we're going to be placing as the kind of base cover, essentially. Quite often, if I want to create the sort of floating camera look, I'll actually take a photograph of the ground before I put the position, and then I'll use that image of the ground to basically create a kind of patch that we'll be using in our editing process. So again, depending on what your output is or your kind of desired goal for the camera, consider taking a kind of ground shot before placing your camera in that position, just in case you want to remove the kind of tripod completely and have a kind of camera suspend in midair. If we're going to be adding text or images to a 360 scene in editing, we need to bear in mind that the way that the lenses work is they are distorted. They're kind of almost fish-eyed. The top and bottom tend to be pinched quite heavily, so we can't just have text or images flat when we're in the editing process. We need to try and bear in mind this distortion. So we'll look at that in some editing videos, but you can't just simply place an image or text into your scene as easily as you may think, because you've got to account for distortion. It's alright having great visuals, but if the audio quality isn't there, then it's kind of a wasting your time. So when we're using 360 cameras, you'll tend to find that the microphones inbuilt tend to be not fantastic in consumer grade kit, so you want to make sure that you've got a separate microphone recording source where possible. So you'll find that in professional filming that they'll use either an ambisonic sound microphone or a series of microphones set up in an array, and they'll then add in this audio afterwards. If you can track or map these audio sounds to your 360 sphere and have an audio sphere within this 360 sphere of visuals, you'll just get a much more immersive end user experience. You'll find that most cameras will advertise a sort of resolution, but on 360 cameras you tend to find that this can be a little bit misleading. I tend to find that the actual resolution of a 360 camera is divided by the number of lenses on that camera. So if a camera advertises itself as 5K, it's actually more likely going to be closer to 2K or 2.5K when viewed either on YouTube or on a VR headset, for example. Whenever we're working with 360 cameras, just always bear in mind that the quality will degrade somewhat from what is advertised due to the stitching process and the editing process that we go through. And these are just some tips and tricks I've learned from using 360 cameras over the last few years. Again, we will be looking at some techniques and some actual in-house practices. We'll be looking at how to edit the footage, how to create visual effects using it, and the many applications that 360 cameras can have in day-to-day life. So I've been Stephen Fisher. Remember to like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you again soon. Goodbye.